Hello, and welcome to your weekly briefing for Global Conflict 1, in which I attempt to document the conflicts and clashes between various different houses and alliances in the world. As we move past that semi-critical 30-day marker, tensions between various alliances have continued to escalate, no more so than the ones between House 19 and, of course, House 9. War between these two houses looks inevitable, and I would have to say it is very likely on a very short-term scale that we will see an all-out war between both of these alliances. So let's take it from the top again, shall we? I will be doing a brief recap of things that we already know from past episodes in case anybody who hasn't watched them needs to get up to speed quickly on what's going on the server. And as per usual, I will be drawing on the map to help you visualize the alliances I'm talking about. So starting in Canada, we have House 2 controlling all of Canada as well as Greenland. Now in the past, House 2 has been strong allies with House 7 and House 12. And things have changed a little bit this week. Officially, House 2 is still allies with House 7. However, this alliance is growing a little tested. I've heard nothing definitive yet that would cause me to believe the alliance has been severed between these two, but there appear to be at least petty squabbles between them, and this likely will weaken the alliance that you see up there. As far as House 15 goes, they are still allies with House 2. Nothing really much more on that front. Of course, House 15 themselves have a sister house in House 18, so nothing has changed there. But when talking about the North American alliance, this is where things get interesting. In the past, I have often questioned the motivation between the House 2 coalition to include House 12. And as it turns out, this week House 12 has actually split off from the House 2, House 7 conglomerate, and appears to either be going their own way, or even more likely, siding up with House 19 and allies. But nothing official on the alliance between House 12 and House 19. Instead, we have House 7 intent on dealing out their own retribution against their former allies, which is rather interesting because usually it takes a very severe rift between houses who were working on the same side to actually go ahead and attack each other when there are so many other potential targets. So, of course, House 12 is quite removed from the North American alliance, which is why I was always doubtful of the likelihood that House 12 could or would remain allied to them. As you can see here, they are the entire world away over here in China, and as anybody who's played the game for long enough knows, it is very difficult to support allies when they are that far away from you. House 12 has also made major gains in Central Europe, namely Germany, and a lot of this is former House 16, because House 16 has been moving a lot of their players back up out of Africa into Europe. But interestingly enough, they have flipped from House 16 to House 12, and I'm not exactly sure why. This is a very recent development, so it is difficult to comment all that knowledgeably on them. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's move down to Brazil and talk a bit about House 10. House 10 in the past has done nothing, really. They are probably one of the most boring houses next to House 17, and that is fine, really. I take no umbrage with them over that. It's just that they're very indecisive. It seems they want to be allies with everybody. For example, I've heard they're on good terms with House 19, of course, and that has been going on for quite some time, but now also House 9 and House 11 and House 17, and of course the allies associated with all of those houses. So, considering that, really, the most likely conflict still remains between House 10 and House 15 in Northern America. So nobody really knows what House 10 is up to, and they don't appear too intent on tipping their hand, although I have gotten word that House 10 considers their friendship with House 9 to be a very strong bond, which could prove rather interesting if House 9 actually ends up going to war against House 19, which, like I mentioned before, from my perspective looks inevitable. Moving over here to Europe. Now, in the past week, the Scandinavian peninsula has been flipped from House 9-14 alliance control to House 19. I've heard differing accounts of how this happened. One is that House 19 simply steamrolled them out of there, and another is that they simply did it diplomatically, and a lot of the players who are threatened simply dropped House and went neutral, or they moved into House 19 themselves. Either way, war between House 14 and House 19. House 14 was the house that formerly controlled the good deal of the Scandinavian peninsula. Relations between House 14 and House 19 have not culminated in an announcement of war yet, although there has been, from what I'm hearing, a lot of speculation that war will likely be declared once the weekend is over. Which would make sense because a lot of players who are spending all day online during the weekend would be going back to their jobs and therefore removed from the game, allowing for a very tactical preemptive strike by either House 19 or House 9. So the alliances do remain largely the same. In House 19, which is the dominant house, you have a sister house of House 5, House 8, and they are allies with House 16. This is really quite blatant now, there is no question about it. House 13, the green house that's largely in Japan, and whatever is left of House 3. There isn't much of it really. Most of the lands that House 3 did control have either been taken over by House 15 there in Sudan, or by House 1, who they were fighting. The House 1, House 3 conflict was always interesting to me because if House 19 saw them as their allies and yet never came to defend them, I have to put into question exactly how allied some of these other houses are with House 19 despite professing to be their allies. So there you go, they're the little sister house lines. I'm sorry, that's terrible. So getting back to the House 9 alliance. House 9 still has House 6 and what's left of House 14 as sister houses. And as we can see here in Africa, a lot of the land and territory that House 14 formerly controlled is now being controlled by House 9. And interestingly enough, players in Sudan have actually moved over to House 15. Much of this territory changing hands is caused by players jumping from house to house. There aren't actually big conflicts in these areas. It is simply a matter of diplomacy between houses and players in them. So players are moving around a good bit yet, probably trying to figure out which house they really want to be in before serious war breaks out on the server. And that's how you have certain players like that number 1 ranking player, I'm sorry I forget your name, it's almost unpronounceable, who is formerly in House 16 has now flipped over to House 1 right here. A lot of players are doing this as the alliance sort of arranges itself on the map. So it's not so much conflict as it is political jousting, I guess you could call it. Jostling for various political positions in the world. And that is one of the caveats to my love of Stronghold Kingdoms, I guess you could say, is the fact that you could be fighting your opponent for a year even. And then at the drop of a hat, sometimes seemingly, they will turn right around and join a different house or stop fighting you just when things were starting to look good or even when things started to look bad. Things can change so much diplomatically in the game, more so than fighting, which is why it is very important that you are either skilled in diplomacy or have a skilled diplomat in your faction to take care of that, because you simply cannot, under the vast majority of circumstances, win through a sheer force of numbers. You're going to need to have some tact to not only maintain your massive empire, but to expand it. And that is often the problem with a lot of the players that grow up fast during the early game. Perhaps their egos get the better of them. They attempt to claim out as much land as they can as quickly as possible. But when other good players, who are probably skilled in diplomacy more than they are, but are moderate builders, start reaching that same level, the inevitable conflicts and clashes ensue, and usually the lesser skilled diplomats are the ones who end up on the bottom of that pile because they are less able to choose their fights and know which battles need fighting and which ones can be postponed. So you end up fighting a war on far too many fronts. So the entire House 9 alliance is so random, so scattered, it is difficult to really determine who besides the sister houses, House 14 and House 6, are actually working with House 9, because Africa is a jumble of houses, especially compared to North and South America, or the Americas, as you could collectively refer to them. So House 14 and House 9 have lost a very large portion of Europe. They mostly just control part of the UK and now France. So when they used to be the dominant force in Europe just 1 week ago, we've seen how quickly things can change, which is why it's difficult to call stuff like this. You never know what another player is thinking, what their plans are, who they're going to backstab. Are we going to see an epic clash between House 9 and House 19, or will more and more players simply just jump over to House 19 when the going gets tough? I would like to think that there is enough competitive nature in this world, given its high player base numbers, that at least some coalition could be thrown up between House 9 and allies against House 19 and allies, because from my perspective right now, it looks I'm very convinced that House 19 has the advantage, the upper hand against House 9. Not just because House 19 owns more land, but because the players in their factions have proven this strategy on the other Europe worlds, where they did form this alliance in a Russian-centric house, bided their time, and then attacked in force, while the other houses were still squabbling amongst themselves. Fortunately, on this map, I guess you could say, there hasn't been a whole lot of infighting, but House 9 and their sister houses, House 6 and House 14, are still fighting House 11. Now, House 11 is interesting because they're still officially on their own. They're not really doing anything. They have lost a little bit of land, but all in all, they're holding out quite well. And from the accounts I'm hearing, the full house of House 11 isn't even at war with House 9, and vice versa. There are only a select couple of factions in House 11 that are actually fighting the House 9 alliance. So I believe this is a likely indicator of a potential peace deal in the future, especially so if House 9 has to redirect their focus to House 19 if House 19 decides to declare war. I believe it will be House 19 that makes the first move in such a conflict, because they have been moving some of their players into the House 9 counties and House 9 parishes. So all evidence is pointing towards House 19 being the aggressor in this situation, which only makes sense because they are the larger and more powerful house in this situation. So if House 9 is forced to deal with the threat posed by House 19, it would be ideal that they finally make a full peace deal with all of House 11 if that is possible. But right now, House 9 is just fighting a couple of factions in House 11. It's sort of like it's like a peace deal in progress. Like, they have made progress from before, because this is the first I've heard of House 9 just being at war with a couple of select factions. Before, it was just the entire house. So it seems that there is progress being made, and most likely, if there is a conflict with House 19, it will accelerate that potential peace deal right there. Of course, as I mentioned before, a lot of House 16 players are moving out of Central Africa and back to Europe. Interestingly enough, some of those players did join House 9, as I pointed out right here, and House 12. So it seems like a lot of the loyalty that was initially shown to the House 16 alliance is largely dead. House 16 doesn't control very much land on the map now at all anymore. I did get the impression that they were a rather weak alliance, but they did show some very early on, they did show some initial aggressive moves, especially towards Central America. I think they flipped Mexico from House 15 at least once, or they did some, I think they flipped a parish or county of House 15's over there in Mexico and took that over for a very brief moment, but that really didn't develop into anything. And now we see they're leaving, they're pulling out of Africa and going back to Europe, probably to get in line with House 19 better, to sort of fortify that area in Europe. And then of course a lot of players have bled out of that house and that alliance. So what you have left of House 16 is largely just a satellite of House 19 now. There really isn't any independence to speak of. In the land down under, we have House 17, who calls House 4 a sister house and is at least allies with House 20. Quite similar to House 10, House 18 and allies don't seem all that interested in provoking any early on attacks. They're mostly satisfied doing their own thing down here, developing and growing. But in the past week, they actually have made advances in Africa, albeit small ones. So very much like House 10, House 17 seems interested in sitting this one out. They might be able to be pulled into a conflict, but right now they seem to be content with letting others do as they will, and the rest of the world seems pretty much okay with leaving them alone. So it's quite mutual, and really not a whole lot of excitement there to talk about. So I do believe that pretty much sums up the diplomacy of the game. However, I would like to focus a little bit more on my personal development. Just today, once we reached day 30 and I logged in, I got 2 achievement notices, and they're Fame Iron and Fame Silver. I got these achievements by pillaging other players. As you can see here, my best rankings, I'm pillager number 14, which isn't too bad for somebody who spent nothing on the game and really hasn't been playing it all that intently, when you consider that USA 3 is, by my standards, my main world. So pillager rank 15 out of 24,000 players. Not bad at all. But I'll likely continue falling now that the leaderboard is actually registering positions on it and players are actually able to get the achievements for hitting these ranks. I will continue to fall as more and more players see this category as an easy way to actually get a hold of those achievements. As per always, I will be including a link to this week's color-coded political map in the description below this video. And as always, I greatly appreciate anybody who volunteers information to help me improve the accuracy of my reporting on this world. So again, if you are a knowledgeable player in the current global theater, please do get in contact with me if you think you have any information that is relevant to this segment that I do. Don't think that just because maybe you're not an officer or a general in the House or the Alliance that your opinion doesn't matter. It does. I'm looking to get as broad a perspective and sample size as possible because that increases the accuracy. If I have multiple players telling me the same thing, it sort of lends a sort of veracity to that information. It sort of validates it, that is actually the majority view on the subject in the world, which is important because I want to report news and happenings in the world that are as relevant as possible, especially to the players in that world. If I'm reporting a niche view, that really does a disservice to my audience here. So if you are in the world, even if you are a smaller fry, if you've heard of diplomatic happenings in the world, I'm interested in hearing from you. So as always, my in-game name is David Spy. That is one word. You can simply shoot me a mail. Let me know what it is. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible, but I don't always respond within the first couple of days. Towards the end of the week, I will definitely be very active gathering information, and you will hear back from me at a much quicker rate. But I read all my mails. If I don't happen to respond to one, it is not because I didn't read it. So your input, as always, is very valuable. It is very important to maintain the highest quality of this segment on my channel. So thank you very much for watching and helping me make this segment as good as it can be. As always, if you have any suggestions or even thoughts and comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.
Stronghold Kingdoms. What will you fight for? Play now for free.